It might be premature to say who failed, who won. I think there was something in this deal for both sides. But indeed, if we look purely at the facts, what happened is that China had an approach, India had an approach, and right now there has been a breakthrough, which seems to be closer to the Indian demands before. But as far as the related economic and strategic aspects are concerned, there are certainly benefits for both sides.
Where are the Chinese spokespeople? Where are the Chinese analysis? There is none. And let me just be abundantly and blatantly direct as I possibly can be. I looked high and low on Baidu. I looked high and low on Weixin, on Weibo, on any number of Chinese sources. The think tanks have been quiet. The government has been quiet. Spokesperson Lin Jian from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not spoken on it in the past few weeks. So we don't really know what the Chinese position is on this. This is unfortunate, and this is the way it goes in covering China.
It is very stressful for the sub-region, for every single election, as we've seen over the last 2 years or so, every single election in the region being like, oh, this is a China-India fight. This is a China-India competition. This has been true in Maldives, it's been true in Mauritius, all over this region. Every time there's an election, it's framed as a competition between India and China. So other countries in the region will increasingly start also pushing back against that logic.
What India is going to do going forward is very similar to what the EU is going to do with China, which is selective economic engagement. So I think what happened before 2020, there was kind of very intimate economic interaction between China and India. And after the 2020 confrontation, there was a very significant overcorrection to the other direction of restraining Chinese economic activity as far as they could do it. And now the pendulum is swinging back toward a more measured approach. The past 4.5 years or 4 years was enough for India to identify the critical areas where it does not want any Chinese presence due to national security concerns. But on the other areas, which are less sensitive, then they might open up more.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, a lot of attention this week on unfolding events in the Middle East and really the dramatic events that we've seen in Syria, where the government of Bashar al-Assad has finally fallen. And I say finally fallen because this has been something that's been in works now for more than a decade, since the Arab Spring and the arrival of the Russians to push back a number of waves of rebellion. The government fell, and that's dominating a lot of the attention. But far away from what's happening there are a lot of events that are happening out here in Asia in particular. And Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has been especially active over the past couple of weeks talking about the border deal with China. This is something that we've been covering for the past several months. And for those of you who are not familiar with what this story is all about, let me just bring you up to speed very quickly. For the past 4 or 5 years, since 2020, tensions between India and China really just descended right into the sewer. And there was a confrontation along their contested border in what's called the line of actual control. And that's something you're going to hear quite a bit in today's discussion, between Chinese and Indian troops. And because there was this interaction and this altercation at several points along their border over the past several years, there has been a ramp up of military engagement on both sides of the border, with both countries deploying huge amounts of heavy armament and soldiers and forces to the region. Then, right before the BRICS summit, we started getting word, and there was a little bit of a surprise announcement that came from the Indian side that said they have reached a deal to disengage. And you're going to hear two terms today over and over again, and I break this down: de-escalation and disengagement. These are two very distinct concepts, which we'll explain later in the program. But the disengagement part of all this has taken place. Let's take a listen now to some of the comments made by India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar. And Cobus, I'd like to get your take on the other side of this, who briefed Parliament last week, and he gave testimony to the lower house of the Indian parliament last week on the status of the current disengagement on the border between Chinese and Indian forces.
Honorable Speaker, sir, I rise to apprise the House of some recent developments in the India-China border areas and their implications for our overall bilateral relations. The House is aware that our ties have been abnormal since 2020, when peace and tranquility in the border areas were disturbed as a result of Chinese actions. Recent developments that reflect our continuous diplomatic engagement since then have set our ties in the direction of some improvement. The House is cognizant of the fact that China is an illegal occupation of 38,000 square kilometers of Indian territory in Aksai Chin as a result of the 1962 conflicts and the event that preceded it. Furthermore, Pakistan illegally ceded 5,180 square kilometers of Indian territory to China in 1963, which has been under its occupation since 1948. India and China have held talks for multiple decades to resolve the boundary issue. While there is a line of actual control, LAC, it does not have a common understanding in some areas. We remain committed to engaging with China through bilateral discussions to arrive at a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable framework for a boundary settlement.
Okay, so those were comments on December 3rd, just 1 week ago, and a lot chillier in the framing, don't you think, a little bit? I mean, two things stood out for me that I'd like to get your reaction to. Number one, he did acknowledge there has been some improvement, but he also acknowledged that there's a long way to go, and ties between these two countries are by no means reset in any way. And so I think if that optimism that we saw before the BRICS summit, when there was this breakthrough, I think you should counter that when you listen to the tone. What was your reaction?
I shared that. It also struck me. And I assumed that part of that was, in the first place, to hedge expectations, because there was such a moment of euphoria right after the BRICS summit. And then also to hedge against domestic political opposition, because just, from having dipped in and out of Indian politics over the years, obviously opposition politics is very contentious in India. And I can well imagine that kind of nationalist or anti-China kind of flanks in the opposition, that they are criticizing the Modi government for this thaw with China, considering how there was before such a drumbeat to escalate tensions. So, I assume that part of that might be, circling around to try and kind of fend off, domestic opposition around the bend.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because right after S. Jaishankar gave his testimony to the lower house of parliament, the opposition Congress party said they were not happy with what the external affairs minister said. They want a full discussion on India-China relations. They don't feel that they have seen enough or heard enough about the details of this détente, and they want to have the chance to push the external affairs minister much more than they were able to in their last sitting in parliament when he gave his testimony last week. Now, this week, let's fast forward to a couple days ago, S. Jaishankar once again appeared back in public again. And this guy, he really is just the gift that keeps on giving people like us, because he is so accessible and he's so present in the media and just has so many great sound bites that it's really quite a pleasure to see what he's saying. And many of you may say after today's show, why don't you have Chinese perspectives on this? Where are the Chinese spokespeople? Where are the Chinese analysis? There is none. And let me just be abundantly and blatantly direct as I possibly can be. I looked high and low on Baidu. I looked high and low on Weixin, on Weibo, on any number of Chinese sources. The think tanks have been quiet. The government has been quiet. Spokesperson Lin Jian from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not spoken on it in the past few weeks. And so we don't really know what the Chinese position is on this. This is unfortunate, and this is the way it goes in covering China, is that we kind of have to do a lot of guessing, and that's where we are. But on the Indian side, a lot of talk, a lot of detail, and a lot of curiosity about it. And so S. Jaishankar, he appeared at the India-Japan Forum in New Delhi this week, and was asked to comment on the current state of India-China relations, and he gave a much more nuanced answer than even what he provided in his testimony to the lower house of parliament.
Our entire relationship with China was predicated on the fact that the border areas would remain peaceful and stable. And we had agreements to ensure that. In 2020, for some reason, which is still a matter of speculation, the Chinese chose to bring a lot of forces to the border areas. And obviously, we responded with counter deployments. And then we had an incident in which a number of soldiers got killed. And obviously, this impacted the relationship. So it has taken us 4.5 years to actually negotiate the disengagement of forces, which is really the fact that the militaries are too close at some places along the line of actual control. We have still challenges left with us. I mean, I made a statement in Parliament on this subject, and we still have to de-escalate, because what we have done is disengage forces from close proximity, but we have a de-escalation because there's still a very large number of forces. But there are, big issues and question marks which have raised, and it has impacted the entire relationship. So now we have to sit down and discuss with China, how do we, in a sense, rebuild our relationship. That is an exercise that still has to be undertaken.
That's a little bit of a positive note, that there's a desire to rebuild the relationship, because we have not heard that kind of rhetoric in years from someone like S. Jaishankar or Narendra Modi, where, if you recall, at the various summits, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS or any of these different gatherings, Xi and Modi couldn't even look at each other. So I guess there's a little bit of room for optimism here, listening to what Jaishankar has to say.
I think so. Other officials have also been talking about the need, for example, to increase business ties and investment ties. And as you were saying, very few Chinese commentators have mentioned that. But relatively recently, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also mentioned the issue, for example, of starting direct flights again. So it's interesting. Like I think both sides are cautiously talking about normalizing relationship. And of course, like having, facilitating investment and trade flows across the border, as it probably end up being their main goal, I assume.
And one very brief disclaimer, and again, this is why it's unfortunate that we don't have Chinese perspectives here. Clearly, Jaishankar was putting the burden for all of the problems on the border right at the feet of the Chinese, blaming them for stealing territory, blaming them for the escalation of tensions. I am 100% certain, and I'm sure, Cobus, you would agree, that if we had Wang Yi on the show, unlikely as it may be, he would probably have a very different take on that. So I just ask all of our listeners to take what Jaishankar is saying in a certain context, that he is speaking solely from the Indian side of all of this, and that the Chinese perspective on this is radically different. That's not a value judgment, just there are very divergent perspectives on this very complex issue. Well, let's get some insight on this, because this is a topic that we have to continually explore in order to peel back the various layers of the onion. And I'm just so thrilled to have on the show for the first time Dániel Balázs, who is a research fellow in the China program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I had a chance to talk with him earlier this week to really unpack all of the different statements coming out of New Delhi and the current status of the China-India border pact as it was signed a couple of months ago. Let's take a listen now to my discussion with Dániel Balázs. Dániel Balázs, welcome to the program. Great to have you on the show for the first time.
Hello, Eric. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
It's really fortuitous that we're speaking to you at this time, because there's been a lot of progress over the past several months in de-escalating some of the tensions and the pullback of troops along the line of actual control along the disputed border between India and China. Just last week, there was a 32nd round of talks between the two sides, and they said that things are going better. There's pressure on Modi coming out of the parliament, where the Congress party wants more information. Last week, S. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, the external affairs minister, kind of updated parliament on the current status. And I'd like to get your take as someone who follows this very closely. Where do you think we are? Have been the movements along the border been real? Should we trust and believe what's happening? There is some skepticism that maybe this is going to be extended for a long time in terms of seeing actual real de-escalation. Or do you feel that there's something substantive that has changed just in this past year?
That's a very good question to ask, and I guess that's the million-dollar question that everybody wants to know. So as far as my observations and my take is concerned, it is very useful to take a look at Minister of External Affairs Jaishankar's recent comments on the border agreement. And maybe apart from those comments specifically, there have been a number of interactions between high-level officials, including the meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of BRICS. And then there was also a meeting between Jaishankar and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And there was, again, the defense ministers of the two sides also have met where they have addressed these questions. In general, what I see happening is that it has been confirmed that disengagement has been completed, which practically means that there were 7 friction points after the 2020 confrontations in the Galvan Valley. And what they have concluded is that soldiers have withdrawn from those 7 friction points. But those are 7 very specific points. There are many other friction points on the border that could give rise to escalation in the future. And in the wake of the 2020 confrontations, both sides have deployed thousands of troops in the area. So disengagement and de-escalation are 2 separate matters. What has happened so far is that disengagement from the 7 friction points has been completed, but de-escalation is the next step. That's what Jaishankar.
Can I just stop you there very quickly? Because I think a lot of people may not be clear on what the technical definition of disengagement is versus de-escalation. And these are very important terms that are being used, particularly in the Indian context, as to what's happening. And there are 2 very distinct phases in this process. You'll hear a lot of Indians, including S. Jaishankar, say we cannot have de-escalation until disengagement is fully realized. Can you help explain those 2 concepts before we go on further?
That's a very good question. Based on the conversation, the public discourse that we see unfolding related to this issue, disengagement is when, let's say, there are Chinese troops and Indian troops right next to each other, very close, which is a very dangerous situation because a misunderstanding between the two sides can lead to a confrontation. And disengagement means that they put distance between the soldiers. So they pull back from these friction points. And that is the phase of the process which has been completed until now. But as far as de-escalation is concerned, that would be something like a reduction of the number of the troops in the border region as a whole.
And that hasn't happened yet, correct?
No.
So they've just pulled the troops back,
Yeah.
but the same number of troops on both sides are still there. They're just not as close to one another.
Exactly. And what Jaishankar has been saying is that now disengagement has been completed and now they are going to discuss the details of the de-escalation.
And what kind of time frame are we talking about here until we can start to expect troops will actually be removed and we move into that de-escalation phase?
That has not been confirmed by either of the sides. And a very interesting related question is that how are the rest of the China-India relationship is going to be impacted, because the Indian side has been very clear that stability and tranquility and peace on the border is the prerequisite for the continuation of China-India relations. And what is unclear right now at this point is that do they have to de-escalate first before they move on to other aspects of the relationship, or is it going to be a concurrent process? And indeed, how long will disengagement last? What we know in terms of time frame is that it has been reported that the special representatives on the border affair are going to meet this month to discuss this disengagement process and the de-escalation. And so if we take a look at the outcome of that meeting, maybe we will have more insights on how long this will take.
But it's interesting because the fact that we're even here appears to me, and I think this is something that you've said as well, is some kind of recognition that the Indian strategy prevailed over the Chinese approach, because the Chinese wanted to, and for years they tried to do this, where they wanted to create silos in the relationship. So they have the border issue as an irritant in the relationship, but the Chinese wanted to develop educational, diplomatic, political, and business ties separate from the border issue. And the Indians said very clearly, there cannot be any restoration of normalcy in the relationship until the border issue is resolved. It does appear, at least, that the focus on resolving the border issue now is some kind of acknowledgement that China's policy, maybe I don't know if failed is the right word. It certainly wasn't as successful as what appears to be Modi's approach to this by forcing the Chinese to the table to negotiate a disengagement with the possibility of a de-escalation.
Yes, that's a great point. Every time we see as Jaishankar making a statement about the border agreement or the border dispute in general, it always consistently mentions that peace and stability on the border is the prerequisite of proceeding with the rest of the relationship. While the Chinese side, as you have rightly pointed out, tried to separate the border issue from the rest of the relationship. It might be premature to say who failed, who won. I think there was something in this deal for both sides. But indeed, if we look at purely at the facts, what happened is that China had an approach, India had an approach, and right now there has been a breakthrough, which seems to be closer to the Indian demands before. But as far as the related economic and strategic aspects are concerned, there are certainly benefits for both sides.
I'd like to step back a little bit, and maybe let's go back to 2023, 2022, when the negotiations for what we saw happen this year really started to pick up pace. And I wanted to see if you can maybe take us into the strategic planning seminars or the policy rooms for the Chinese and the Indians to better understand the motivations of both sides. We've spoken to a number of people who said basically the cost of maintaining this force posture was too prohibitive, was just too costly for both countries, and that China itself had other priorities, namely in the Western Pacific centered around Taiwan, whereas India was draining resources, and also recognized maybe that it simply can't keep up with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese military is significantly larger, much more advanced, and by kind of mounting as many resources as they did in the Himalayas, it's taking away from other priorities, namely in Pakistan and the Indian Ocean region. Can you help us understand, we'll start with India first and then go to China, but help us understand some of the political and military calculations that Modi made in reaching this decision to start the disengagement?
Again, you raise very good points, and I agree with them. Maintaining the status, the kind of tensions that have been brewing since 2020 was very costly for both sides, both for India and China, and they both had, better directions to spend their resources on. So as far as India is concerned, as far as the motivations for reaching this conclusion is concerned, I like to divide them into internal drivers and external drivers behind the decision. Let's start with the internal ones, because they have been quite prevalent in related reporting. There has been very frequent reporting on saying that there has been some pressure from the business community in India to revise the posture related to China. Because what happened, let's take a step back. What happened is that the two sides confronted each other in 2020. And after that, India has implemented a couple of economic steps, which some regard as punitive measures on Chinese companies and on which restrained Chinese economic interaction.
Yeah, these were very aggressive. So they were using tax enforcement, so much so that I remember Huawei and Xiaomi and some of the Chinese tech companies had to evacuate their expatriate staff for fear that they would be arrested. There were raids of Chinese companies. It was very aggressive. I mean, this was not just a simple kind of brush against the Chinese company. It was a full-on assault of, particularly in the tech companies.
Yes, exactly. And apart from that, India also banned some applications, and there was significant restrictions toward Chinese foreign direct investments toward India, which could be maintained for a while, but certainly not indefinitely, especially considering India's kind of ambitions in the economic sphere, which practically need input from China. And if you look at the trade relationship between the two sides, even against the backdrop of punitive economic measures, the trade relationship between the two sides, China has become the most important trade partner of India during this period. So there are certain fundamental drivers that can be countered only to some extent, but it cannot be consistently maintained. And so against the backdrop of this limited Indian efforts to limit Chinese economic activity in the country, they have met with some pushback from the business community in India on the one hand. And what we have seen actually in January this year and later in July is that the Indian government itself practically proposed that, if there is stability on the border, then we might be more welcoming toward, there might be more openness toward Chinese investment than there was before. So this was specifically mentioned by the chief economic advisor in July 2024. That was more like a call for Chinese investments, because allowing more Chinese investments in India would practically facilitate Indian economic ambitions. That was the argument of the chief economic advisor. And back in January at the Davos Forum, an Indian government official mentioned that India might loosen the restrictions on Chinese investments as long as the situation on the border is stable.
But it seems again that India is a little bit schizophrenic on this, because I'm looking at a headline today from The Hindu that was actually written by Press Trust India, where Jaishankar warned business leaders in India not to become excessively dependent on one country, and saying, and let me just read you the subheadline, Mr. Jaishankar said India doesn't want to, quote, end up as a market for another economy, that's China, and not be able to compete with their products, which are, quote, dumped into our country. So on the one hand, they're talking about closer business ties, and on the other hand, they're saying, be very careful, don't get too close, because then we'll create some dependencies, which are potentially very dangerous.
Exactly. That's, again, a very good insight. My take on this is that what India is going to do going forward is very similar to what the EU is going to do with China, which is selective economic engagement. So I think what happened before 2020, there was kind of very intimate economic interaction between China and India. And after the 2020 confrontation, there was like a very significant overcorrection to the other direction of restraining Chinese economic activity as far as they could do it. And now the pendulum is swinging back toward a more measured approach. So let's say that the past 4.5 years or 4 years was enough for India to identify the critical areas where it does not want any Chinese presence due to national security concerns. But on the other areas, which are less sensitive, then they might open up more. That would be my take on how it's going to fold out in the next couple of months or years.
Okay, so you talked about the pressure from the business community, and this is particularly germane now because there's this China plus one wave that's starting to happen in other parts of Asia. So in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Indonesia are benefiting enormously from Chinese offshoring of certain manufacturers, a way to maybe avoid some of the sanctions or some of the tariffs from the United States. India has not been benefiting as much from that. So you can see, for example, they do want to capture more of that manufacturing FDI coming from China, either by the Chinese or by foreign companies who used to be operating in China. Talk to us a little bit about some of the military and strategic calculations. So it was expensive for the Indians to maintain such a large presence along that border. It did divert resources from Pakistan and other areas. How much did that weigh into Prime Minister Modi's decision, in your view?
That's a good point. As far as the reporting and observations that I have conducted in the past couple of months, certainly it was draining away resources. Maintaining such a military posture always drains away resources. But if I look at the public discourse related to the topic, I would say that the mentioning of economic drivers was more prevalent as far as my observations were concerned. So certainly there was a military element to it, but I would say that the economic was slightly more pronounced.
And what about the politics? This happened not by coincidence in my view, but I'm not an expert here, but it happened when Modi was in his third term. He can't run for re-election again. During the run-up to the election, he kept rather quiet on China, but from time to time, he would speak out and kind of feed the very strong sense of anti-Chinese nationalism that kind of courses through Indian media and Indian intelligentsia quite a bit. What role did politics play in all of this in terms of Modi's position as a politician who didn't have to run for re-election and could take a bolder move than if he was up for re-election?
So when it comes to territorial disputes, it's not only in India, I would say it's quite an international phenomenon that being able to defend the territory, having the resolve and not budging not an inch of the homeland is always very strictly tied to the legitimacy of a leader. And if there was any opportune moment to kind of make a deal, then this was it. Yes, it comes shortly after the re-election of Modi. And as you have mentioned, again, there is no running for office again. So I think this was probably the most opportune moment to make this deal.
Okay, well, let's now kind of look at the other side of the border, head up to Beijing. What do you think some of the calculations were from the Chinese point of view in terms of why they chose now to make potentially what looks like some concessions? Because up until now, the Chinese had been very firm and said not 1 inch. They published new maps last year of that really demarcated a very clear line of the border. I mean, there it was in black and white. This is our territory. We're not going to budge. We're not pulling back. Xi has a style that is very unforgiving in terms of border negotiations. We see this playing out in the South China Sea. We see it in Taiwan and some other places. So this type of concession is not something that I think a lot of people had on their bingo card, but here we are. So what were some of the calculations that you think President Xi made and why he wanted to negotiate now to try and de-escalate this?
That's a very good point. And I did look specifically into that. What were the kind of external and potentially internal motivators for the Chinese move on this matter? And as far as the strategic level is concerned, I think there were mostly 2 or 3 elements that influenced decision making. What happened after 2020 is that India in general, following a policy, it's very committed to a policy of strategic autonomy, which is diversifying its strategic partners, not being overly dependent on one specific partner, but keeping options open and practically walking its own way in the international system. But after the 2020 confrontation, there was a perceptible strategic tilt from India toward the US and the Quad. There was some cooperation on intelligence sharing equipment. The US and India also signed the foundational agreements, which is related to cooperation on logistics between the 2 militaries. So there was a significant strategic tilt, which doesn't really go well with China, because China for a very long time has had this, I'm not sure what's the best way of describing it, but let's say it's a perception, is that the US is trying to sway India into an anti-Chinese coalition.
Oh, well, I think that's been pretty obvious, and they've been very blatant about that they want to bring India away from China and into the Quad. You know, obviously they're in the Quad, but firmly in the Quad and part of this coalition that's going to counter China. But again, to your point, Indian foreign policy has had a long-standing emphasis on strategic autonomy, which may not be something that the Americans fully appreciate to the fullest extent.
Absolutely. And China is in a very delicate strategic position when it comes to the border, because I think on the one hand, they have to deter what they call Indian adventurism, like Indian moves on the border have to be deterred by a strong position. But at the same time, the deterrence cannot be so much that India will just join the US in this coalition against China, or perceived coalition against China. So that's a very delicate position. And I think what happened, the pendulum swing there also. And they made the decision that, if we take this step, reach a border patrol agreement, then we are going to put some distance between India and the US. And that is always good for them, for the Chinese leadership from a strategic level. That was one. And I think the other very significant element is related to BRICS. The BRICS summit happened just a couple of days after China and India has reached this border patrol agreement. If you look at the related discourse in China related to BRICS, so BRICS seems to be like a champion of the global South. China is trying to develop it into being a collective voice of the global South and getting a seat at the table for the developing nations and striving for multipolarity, democratizing international relations. That's only doable if the BRICS is united to some extent, if there is a certain level of unity within BRICS. And if you look at 2 of the most significant players in BRICS having this thorny territorial dispute between them and not seeing eye to eye on it, that would practically undermine Chinese ambitions related to BRICS. So I think this was a second element that influenced this.
And I guess the same could be said for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well.
Absolutely.
How much do you think the Philippines played into all of this? And let's kind of look at Chinese foreign policy priorities as a hierarchy of values and interests, and where we put the South China Sea, Taiwan, clearly at the top of that list. Confrontation with the United States also very high on that list in terms of trying to get the U.S. out of the Western Pacific or to significantly reduce its force posture in the Western Pacific. And when you look at where the conflict with India or the border dispute with India was, is probably much lower on that, given those other interests that you talked about, the BRICS, the SCO, global governance, the global South, all of those different issues. And one of the theories that I kind of formulated in my head, which was China has sought to portray itself as a reasonable actor on territorial disputes. So with Vietnam, it says we negotiate diplomatically to solve these issues. Same with Malaysia, same with Indonesia. And yet Philippines is the only one out there right now that in the South China Sea dispute that has had a confrontational approach. By saying, see, with India, we were able to resolve this diplomatically, they can further isolate the Philippines as an outlier who is acting at the behest of the Americans. And now we're already starting to see some pressure in the Philippines discourse that maybe we should do what India did. There's starting to be some bubble up. Interestingly, I don't know if some of those narratives coming up out of the Philippines may be injected by Chinese disinformation campaigns to, again, trying to isolate the Marcos government, but using what's happening on the India-China border as an example of how reasonable China is with its territorial disputes. You see, even with people who we went to war with, we are able to resolve a border dispute. Even when we had thousands of soldiers there, we're able to resolve a border dispute. Do you see how unreasonable you are, Mr. Marcos? You're the only one who can't negotiate with us. Everybody else can negotiate peacefully with us. I'm just wondering if you think that line of thinking has any merit.
That could be. Although my take on that would be maybe slightly different, which is that it is difficult to concurrently maintain multiple active border disputes. By maintaining, I mean like maintaining the force posture that we have just discussed. So maybe there was a decision made at the strategic level of that, yes, out of the two, which one is going to cost us less to maintain. And the decision that they have reached was probably related to the Philippines, because if you look at one of the biggest difference is there are many differences between the South China Sea dispute and the China-India border dispute, but the South China Sea dispute is a maritime border dispute, which is practically it's more difficult to project power across the water, but that also means that it's easier to keep a dispute active, and maybe it even consumes less resources. And certainly, if the Indian one has been kind of settled to some extent, then there are certainly more resources to be used on the South China Sea.
Okay, let's look to the future now. We're in this state of disengagement, not de-escalation. Things seem to be progressing. Again, the 32nd round of talks occurred recently, and both sides came out of these talks feeling pretty positive. Let's be very clear, they have not always come out of these talks feeling very positive, so we must take them at their word when both sides say, yeah, things are progressing, things are okay, even when the External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, goes to Parliament and briefs the opposition party on this. The feedback isn't as toxic as it used to be. There is a different tone in New Delhi today. Certainly, the Chinese have dialed down their rhetoric as well. Help us look ahead into 2025. What are you looking at in terms of the direction that this relationship is going and the direction that these border talks are heading in? What are you forecasting for 2025?
First of all, I would like to point out that I agree with what you have mentioned, is that the related rhetoric on both sides have been much more, let's say, optimistic or positive. And that started immediately around, actually that has started for a while now, even before the 21st of October agreement. In Chinese media, I think there were some reports saying that the two sides are building up momentum for a potential breakthrough. So that happened even before the agreement. And after the agreement, yes, the rhetoric on both sides and on the Chinese side was also very positive, that everything is going according to plans. They are on the border, the de-escalation is proceeding well. And that is certainly a positive thing. As far as the future is concerned, I think that could be something that maybe there will be a new normal of economic relations between India and China, which kind of pertains to what we have discussed, is that maybe in the past 4 years, India has managed to figure out what are the sensitive sectors that it still wants to keep China out of, and what are those sectors where they are more willing to engage with China. That's one element from the Indian side. From the Chinese side, I would say that there will be certainly a bit of less enthusiasm toward business ties and even a bit more skepticism, because if you look at the related reports, we still see state media saying that India has to work hard to regain the trust of Chinese business and it has to establish like a favorable investment environment to do it. So I don't think it will be like a snap and then we go back to pre-2020 in the economic sphere. But that will be the broader direction toward more selective engagement. That will be one element. And I think what will also be a crucial factor in 2025 is how President-elect Donald Trump is going to establish his taxation and tariff policies. Because if you look at the related rhetoric, there are some points which are very China specific. Actually, I think there were like 3 tariffs mentioned which are very specifically related to China, but there are also other tariffs which are very broad based and it could impact India as well. So if the two sides choose to react to US, what they call US protectionism, by kind of reducing their dependence on the US market and looking toward each other, that could be an additional driver for more closer economic interaction.
That's interesting that Donald Trump may actually have an effect on bringing India and China closer together, depending on how things unfold. I hadn't really thought of that. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to shed some light on what is an extraordinarily complicated issue and one that I think is poorly understood by the outside world. So we definitely appreciate your insights on that. Dániel Balázs is a research fellow who specializes in China-India relations in the China program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And NTU is just a wonderful program and wonderful university there. We have a lot of engagements with them, and so we're thrilled to have you on the show, Daniel, and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for your time as well. And I'm very happy that we had this chat.
Cobus, throughout the discussion with Daniel, and it was fantastic to have him on the show for the first time, and I'm so happy that we're starting to engage RSIS at Nanyang Technological University. They have some fantastic scholars there. So it's really a great opportunity for us to dive into this a lot more. But one of the themes that you heard in that discussion was this overhanging concern about the incoming Donald Trump administration. Not sure what's going to happen. We have a lot of variables here. And remember that there's as much concern in New Delhi as there is in Beijing. Okay, maybe that's overstating it. Maybe not quite as much concern. But there's a lot of concern in New Delhi about tariffs and the disruptions to the global supply chains and all of the disruptions to the international system. And so I thought Daniel was kind of, alluding to it, but this is something that you have been following quite a bit in terms of the great power competition as it's playing out in different parts of the world. And we really are staring into an abyss in some respects that we just don't know what's at the bottom of this, because we don't really have any visibility as to what Trump and his various secretaries are going to do. So I think that's an X factor hanging over all of this.
Yes, I mean, it's an X factor hanging over the whole world, and certainly Asia is particularly feeling it. I think there is this kind of twin issues of, on the one hand, Trump may well, add pressure on India in the form of tariffs or other forms of pressure. On the other hand, he may also weaken Western relationships between the US and its Western allies, which may, for example, add some complication to the disagreement between India and Canada about allegations of a targeted killing in Canadian territory. Under Biden, there was a relative level of coordination between the US and Canada on this issue, but who knows what's going to be under Trump. So it's not only Trump's direct relationships with Asia, it's also how his relationships with these other allies affect, larger relations of Asia and the world.
Yeah, and one has to wonder how dedicated Trump is going to be to some of the alliances that have really blossomed in the Biden administration, namely the Quad. And as we talked about with Daniel, one of the calculations that may have been factoring into Xi Jinping's approach on this, and the reason why he wanted to strike this deal now with Modi and India to disengage and de-escalate, might have been to, again, try and put a wedge in between India and the rest of the Quad members. We don't know if Trump is going to invest in these partnerships, in these alliances, in these groupings that have been so effective in effectively surrounding China. So we have the Quad, we have the Squad, we have AUKUS, we have the U.S., Japan, U.S., Philippine and U.S., South Korean security partnerships and alliances, and Trump has not really been as passionate about those alliances. So if there can be some distance put in between India and the rest of the Quad, and if Trump lets those relationships flounder a little bit, that could be an opening for China.
That could be. It could also just simply, increase chaos and lessen coordination more broadly, which also would give China a little bit more anxiety, I think, but also at the same time a lot more maneuverability. So it seems like on the Chinese side, like it's hedging season at the moment. Everyone is like, they're really trying to kind of cover their bases in all directions and then just kind of battening down and seeing what's coming.
And I think when you hear the tone of S. Jaishankar, and I think that was really revealing to me to hear the language that he used in the testimony before Parliament, there's still a lot of skepticism in this relationship. And it's going to take years for them to do the reset, as he said. But just as there is a de-escalation, disengagement happening on the line of actual control in the Himalayas, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the competition for the Indian Ocean region remains just as intense as ever. And we have heard that President Xi is going to be making a trip to Africa in January. That is not confirmed. That is just from a reliable source. Wouldn't surprise me because remember, the Chinese foreign minister always makes his first overseas visit of the year, always begins in Africa. And the fact that Xi would maybe join the foreign minister as part of that, or together they would go, not surprising. My guess is that there might be an Indian Ocean stop because strategically that makes a lot of sense for the Chinese right now, especially because of the vulnerability that they have with their supply chains coming out of the Persian Gulf. And that is a worry for them. So that Indian Ocean, those sea lanes are incredibly important. So I always think that there's going to be a stop in the Indian Ocean. It doesn't always happen, but this year it might be there. And that would be something that could potentially unnerve folks in New Delhi because they see that as their traditional sphere of influence.
Yes, it could be. I mean, that then raises larger questions about how these two powers are going to balance their different regional influence building. Like, it is very stressful for the sub-region, for every single election, as we've seen over the last 2 years or so, every single election in the region being like, oh, this is a China-India fight. This is a China-India competition. Like, this has been true in Maldives, it's been true in Mauritius, it's, all over this region. Every time there's an election, it's framed as a competition between India and China. So, other countries in the region will, I think, increasingly start also pushing back against that logic. And I think it would probably be in both China and India's interest to try and defuse that particular narrative, or to complicate it at least, and to find some kind of like competitive coexistence where they manage to get growth from that competition, but without adding so much stress to the region.
And just one little footnote to all of this is there's been a competition over the past year over the various smaller states in South Asia and whether the new leaders will be going to Beijing first or go to New Delhi first. So we had the Maldivian prime minister, I think he's the prime minister, went to Beijing first. Also, Nepal's new prime minister went to Beijing first, signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, by the way. But yet we just got word this week that Sri Lanka's new head of state, his new prime minister, went to New Delhi first. And this is something that it may seem a little bit petty and silly about where they go, but in all of the kind of horse trading that goes on in terms of looking at South Asian politics, people are closely watching which way these other states are going. And they say that by going to Beijing first over going to New Delhi or vice versa, that it somehow shows their preference. And I always think of you, Cobus, because this is how these smaller states are trying to manage these rivalries. And remember, we talk about the U.S.-China rivalry, but that's not the only rivalry that's out there. The India-China rivalry for countries in South Asia, in many ways, is more consequential. And so it's interesting just to keep tabs on which of these countries are leaning which way. Now, they will all tell you on the record, with all the seriousness, that they don't have a preference. So you'll hear them, just as in the U.S.-China relationship, say, we don't want to have to pick a side. They also say this in the India-China relationship. But clearly the decision as to where they go first is I don't want to read too much in it, but it's a calculated decision, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, they know it will be read as a signal, which means that they have to plan for it to function as a signal. And yeah, I mean, I think in each case, it also reveals some of their particular issues, particularly around debt, around infrastructure financing, and so on. And also, in some cases, it also reveals kind of unhappiness with earlier relationships. So there's been kind of grumbling in Nepal, for example, through the years about India's quote unquote kind of overweening kind of influence influence in Nepal, for example.
Yeah, same in Maldives.
Same in Maldives.
They were very upset that India was overbearing. And then remember, there was these pictures, I don't remember the details, of Modi on the beach in the Maldives and being very disrespectful. And that got everybody worked up and excited. So these things, they do kind of balance on these very thin lines sometimes. The politics can be quite sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a weird thing where even though these countries are so disempowered, they also now take on these kind of outsized, kind of symbolic roles. So it's a weird kind of play of optics and substance.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. Just a reminder that Cobus and the CGSP team and I, we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus, a little break. We're closing in on 80 shows this year, though, Cobus.
Wow.
80 shows we did this year.
That's a lot of babbling.
That's a lot of babbling. So we're going to take the last 2 weeks the last week of the year off and the first week of the new year off of the show. But we will have our year in review show and a year in preview show for you during our brief hiatus, and then we'll be back in the first week of January. There shouldn't be too much interruption for you on the podcast feed, our site, and our newsletter. Those will dial down a little bit, except for breaking news. I've told the team, I said the one thing that we will have to interrupt our vacation for, of course, is if Chinese President Xi Jinping does make a visit to Africa before we're off on holiday. I don't think he's going to show up before the 6th of January if he does go to Africa, but you never know. You never know. So we'll be on standby if he does. Let's leave the conversation there. Of course, if you want to see everything that we're doing at the China Global South Project, make sure you go over to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And there you can sign up to receive the wonderful work that Cobus, Giraud, Johnny, Edwin, Lucy, and the rest of the team are doing in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to track Chinese engagement in the Global South, in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This is really a unique service. There's nobody else doing this kind of work, especially that's independent, fact-free, agenda-free, and it needs your support. It really, really does. This work does not come free. It is really important that we have independent voices from the Global South who are articulating how these geopolitical dynamics are playing out in their regions. And so that's why if you go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, sign up for a subscription. They start at $19 for everybody. But then if you are a student or teacher, send me an email, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll give you the half-off links. Be sure to use your school email address. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.